So the narrative about Canada's housing crisis has changed fundamentally over the past 9 months. Today, I'm going to talk about what I think is sort of the big mistake many experts made, and maybe try to understand why those mistakes were made. Not just experts, even our government as well. So today, we need to kind of rewind the clock before we get to what's going on today to understand, what many people, what experts, what politicians were saying about our housing crisis 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I'm very confident if you kind of rewind the clock, if you look at many of the opinion pieces in the newspaper, read many of the reports, and if we could rewind the clock and ask people back then why home prices are so high in Canada, what the experts think is sort of the root cause, I'm pretty confident that 9 out of 10 people would tell you that the experts think our housing crisis is due to a lack of supply. Our politicians were saying that. Bank of Canada was saying that. Pretty much every housing academic was really focusing on a lack of supply driving up Canada's home prices. That was the narrative that was going on up until maybe about 9 months ago, quite frankly, that our whole housing crisis and elevated crisis is due to red tape, municipalities that are restricting zoning, that are not legalizing housing, allowing fourplexes, allowing all of these policies that would encourage more housing. And it's the municipalities who are restricting supply and leading to red tape that's causing this housing crisis. This was the narrative, the idea that many people were floating, again, like I said, up until about 9 months ago. Now, I never really bought that idea. Many reasons. Honestly, you just really need to look at the data. And if we looked at, Canada's population growth compared to housing completions, we can see pretty clearly that after 2015, population growth skyrocketed. Canada was growing by about 350,000 people per year, definitely under 400. And we hit 1.2 million over the past couple of quarters. And yes, population growth dipped during COVID, but you can kind of see it was pretty much a straight line up. Whereas housing completions didn't really move. They kind of were pretty flat. So, to look at the data and to conclude that after this booming population and sort of the housing completions not changing, that the cause of the crisis is not the explosion in our population growth, but rather the fact that housing completions have not accelerated, requires some intellectual and statistical gymnastics, quite frankly, to come to that conclusion. It's not a rational conclusion because, as we've seen, it's very, very easy to ramp up Canada's population growth and, by extension, the demand for housing. That's very easy to do. Our government did that. We have among the fastest growing populations right now at 3% per year in pretty much any developed country. So that's easy to do. What's not easy is to triple our housing completions. And despite all of the supply side policies that governments had put out recently, housing starts are actually declining. So it's a bit misleading, I thought, to argue that this is all coming down to a supply issue. So in 2011, I wrote a piece sort of challenging. Again, it was a big bank economist who came out and said that this is our housing crisis again is just a supply issue and we need to build more homes. And they kind of gave their considered argument. And I argued that, it's a bit silly to just blame supply. Obviously, if you're ramping up your population growth, you kind of are creating a housing shortage. So sure, we need more supply, but that is a side effect of the booming population. So I wrote back then a few years ago, and I'll quote it. I said, as a start, our federal government's decision to raise immigration targets today without making the corresponding supply side housing policy changes needed to increase supply is a decision to inflate home prices out of reach of most Canadians tomorrow, including many of our newest fellow citizens. Going forward, immigration targets need to line up with bold housing policy to avoid a rapid acceleration in house prices that hurts affordability and the viability of our society as a well-functioning whole. So my argument was quite simple. Population growth and immigration targets should line up with housing completions in Canada. I mean, I didn't think that was such a controversial argument, but when I was making it, of course, it proved to be controversial. I mean, at the time, I had people saying I'm anti-immigrant, I'm blaming students, I'm xenophobic, all of these types of things, because in their mind, um, it's really a supply issue, and we don't need to scale back our population growth. We can grow at an unlimited rate, apparently, if we just remove the red tape and sort of legalize housing. And this was the common argument back then. And obviously, I was getting the criticism at the time. Um, I mean, but I don't want to say I don't really care because that's kind of a bit harsh. The reality is, I mean, I do care. I mean, I'm very mindful of what people think about what I say, which is why I'm pretty considered when I think about them, and I'm very mindful about how I communicate what I'm saying. So I was never making an anti-immigration kind of argument. I didn't really have any requirement on the level of our population growth beyond the fact that we have homes for people. So I kind of stuck to my argument for years because I mean, I was convinced that eventually the narrative would change because this whole idea that it's a supply problem did not make sense. And it took several years, but of course, the narrative did change. And even though our government for years was also sticking with the supply argument, I mean, you can look up countless interviews from our prime minister, finance minister, all of them kind of repeating this. It's a supply problem until our federal budget, 2024 budget. And interestingly enough, in the housing section of the budget, the federal government talks about aligning immigration with housing capacity. And I'm going to read one kind of paragraph they had after talking about obviously the important role that immigration and has in Canada. They said, but our ability to successfully welcome new Canadians depends on having the physical capacity to do so properly. In particular, having enough homes. That's why current housing pressures mean that Canada is taking a careful look to make sure immigration does not outpace our ability to supply housing for all. So this is a complete turnaround in the narrative we've been hearing for years. So after being told for years that our crisis is just due to a lack of supply, and supply can keep up with our population that went from 350,000 people per year to growing by 1.2 million. I mean, now we're hearing that, I mean, and it should be pretty obvious that that wasn't possible. And our government's taking the foot off the gas on our population growth rate to take pressure off of house prices. So, you know, I think the one key takeaway, obviously, here is that the experts who were kind of making this supply only argument got it wrong. I mean, I mean, the evidence is you can't get much clearer. I mean, even our federal government has completely turned around their policies, shifted and started talking about the role that immigration and population growth has in the housing section of our budget. So it's probably like the biggest mea culpa you're going to see, from a federal government sort of kind of admitting that they kind of screwed up a little bit and are kind of revisiting, how our population is growing. Now, one thing worth kind of thinking about, at least for me, is why this happened. I mean, why for years um, did so few people kind of raise the red flags about our population growth? And I'll say a few economists did. Many of them were actually more, labor economists or immigration economists. I mean, very few. I actually can't even think of any housing economists, that were raising the red flags. I mean, they were observing it, but no one said, well, this is actually too rapid a growth for us to solve our rental crisis or our housing crisis. We need to kind of take the foot off the gas on population growth for supply to catch up. Can't think of too many people who said that. And I think it's important to understand why everyone had this singular focus on supply for so many years. I mean, for me, it's important to revisit it because, I mean, I think it helps us kind of understand our environment. It helps us understand the expert opinions, the world we live in, the people that we deal with. And, when I started thinking about why we were stuck in that narrative, which I mean proves to be wrong. And again, for clarity, the wrong part is not that we need more supply. We obviously need more supply. The wrong part was for years blaming municipalities and zoning restrictions for a housing crisis when it was really driven by an unprecedented population boom. I mean, this is the wrong part for clarity. We still have a housing shortage in Canada. And many of the supply side measures that the federal government's been pushing for now are important. So, when we think about, when I think about, why we were stuck in that mindset, which proves to be incorrect. I mean, it kind of reminded me of conversations I had when I was quite young, um, with my father, actually. So I actually had to, I mean, I kind of got into real estate, not the way most people did. I was 23. I was a student still actually in university. But my dad got MS. It affected him cognitively, which means he couldn't really do many of the things he did before. And 90% of the time he couldn't think clearly. 10% of the time he could, and he was very clear-headed, but he couldn't do the work, quite frankly. So I had to kind of take over with his business effectively. And I remember one time, I mean, I feel like I had these conversations so many times with him, but there's one conversation we had where I think I was like looking at a commercial property or looking at buying something, and he comes into my room. He's like, "Well, what do you think about this property?" I said, "Well, the real estate broker thinks it's great. Our lawyer Lou thinks it has all these issues. So, I'm more inclined to trust the lawyer, and I think we should pass on it." Um, and he says to me, "I didn't ask you what the broker said. I didn't ask you what the lawyer thinks. I asked you what you think." And of course, I mean, I was what do you want from me? I'm 23 years old. I'm a student. What the hell do I know about commercial real estate? Um, what did he say to me? I mean, my dad would do these things where he like look at you for like 5 seconds, which feels like an eternity in that moment. Um, and he said something like, okay, this is what he said. He said, "I have two things to say to you." It's like, firstly, you were born here. English is your first language, and you're studying at one of the top universities in Canada. He said, "If you don't think you have the capacity to learn what I learned as an uneducated immigrant who didn't even speak the language when I got here," he's like, "No problem. Let me know. And I'll see if one of your younger brothers is up to the task." I mean, he was a bit ruthless in his criticisms, but I mean, it was kind of a valid point, I mean, at the time. Um, and then he said, "Assuming you want to keep doing this stuff, the other thing you need to keep in mind is that it's important to ask the broker his opinion, the accountant, the lawyer, get everyone's opinion. Um, get them to tell you why they think it's great, get them to tell you why they think you're making a mistake." But, his argument was you need to be mindful of the fact that all of their opinions are rooted in their biases, their personal fears, their personal concerns about real estate, their business environment, how the people they work with approach real estate, and in particular, real estate investing, their fears of the outcome of their advice, like the lawyer's fear about, not giving the right advice and things going wrong and me blaming it. So all of everyone's opinion is rooted in some sort of bias, whether it is their professional, their personal, or their fears of the advice that they're giving. So, his argument was you need to kind of take in all of this information, try to separate the bias from the true risks. Think about if you can mitigate those risks. And if you can, and if you think it's a good investment, then don't worry about what the lawyers tell you and the 40-year or 50-year-old lawyer who's more educated. Even if they think you're an idiot and you're making a wrong decision, it's like if you thought about it, you thought about the risks, stick to your guns and do what you're doing. And that was basically kind of his pep talk, which I think I had like 50 times over the span of a number of years. And when I think back at that, I mean, I think for me, I mean, that was I mean, these ideas were actually quite relevant, I mean, in every aspect of my life. I mean, this idea that when we're communicating with people in every aspect, not just in business, that how they react, their opinions, their views are a function of their lived experience, their fears, all of these things. It kind of transforms how we connect and we relate with people. But I think in this context, I think it's important to remember that these same ideas, I think, hold. I mean, and when we think about the narratives and the ideas and the biases that maybe would have shaped this supply focused idea for so many years, I think there's a couple. I mean, for starters, I think academia has this, at least in North America. Europe's quite different, but in North America, there is a very strong focus on that. High home prices are almost exclusively caused by zoning restrictions and supply elasticity and all of these. So I do think there is a strong bias in academia with these narratives, but also I think the bigger issue, quite frankly, is that I think there is, I mean, sticking to the common narratives is quite safe, I should add. It's when you kind of deviate from what everyone else is saying can get risky. And the risk is that if you kind of talk about the key driver is the population growth as an academic or as a housing expert, you have the same risks that I had, which is being accused of all sorts of terrible things. And actually, I'm going to read a tweet from Mikhail Skuterud, who was actually on our show a while ago, and who's actually one of the economists who was raising the red flags about Canada's population growth, and in response to a critique that academics were largely to blame for our housing crisis. He responded and he said that many academics have questioned the Liberal Party's immigration agenda, but have been ignored or hesitant to express their concerns publicly for fear of being deemed anti-immigrant or worse. And I think that's an important point that, many experts maybe would have been reluctant to kind of have that narrative because they would have come off, or maybe people would have challenged them and criticized them for blaming immigrants or blaming students, which obviously is a challenging thing to face when you're an academic. I mean, if you look at what's going on in many universities these days, many academics are getting fired for these types of issues, for social issues. I mean, you have students kind of complain, they don't agree with a professor's opinion, they think it's racist or xenophobic. Academics are quite vulnerable to these sensitive issues these days. So I think that could definitely have colored people's opinions, because I don't think it's that people didn't realize this was an issue. I think very few people voiced their concerns about our booming population growth. And it's interesting that maybe even many of the people who would have been impacted by this crisis, who kind of would have raised the criticisms about, calling me kind of anti-immigration or xenophobic or all of these types of things, are the people who were, also equally impacted by it. And I think if we did not have this, and again, I think this is part of sort of, I guess, a societal trend where people just want to, rather than criticizing ideas, they're intent on kind of criticizing an individual's character, makes, I think, some people vulnerable, obviously. And I think for me, even if I look back, I think, you know, I was critical of many of those experts, quite frankly, who were just staying silent. And I think I was critical of them. I mean, partly because of my own bias. Everyone has their own quirks, but, because I'm confident in my opinion and have no problem voicing my opinion and have no problem being called all sorts of terrible things because what I believe is correct, and eventually, I think the narrative would change. It doesn't mean everyone else wants to be in that position. It doesn't mean that everyone else also wants to be that vocal, to be called all, sorts of terrible things, potentially from their students, potentially from their peers in the university, and in some cases having their jobs jeopardized and their careers jeopardized. I mean, even though obviously these criticisms were ridiculous. I mean, it's not anti-immigration to say that our population growth should match housing completions. I mean, it's obviously not. But again, I mean, the narratives today are not rooted in many times in considered thought, but in emotion. So when people were making these, I mean, they weren't rational opinions. Again, like had someone made a rational argument against my argument, all these years, of course I would have considered it. The greatest gift someone could give you is to convince you you've kind of have an error in your thinking and to reshape your thinking. So I'm not so invested in being right that I would not change my opinion, but no one did that. I mean, most of these arguments that people were making against me were all just emotional and knee jerk and name calling effectively. So, I think all of this is important when we think about the expert opinions we hear about in society, not just, yesterday with our housing crisis, but today and tomorrow. And quite frankly, even the role that many of us play on environments like Twitter, where everyone's very quick to name call and very quick to criticize. And I think that's also something that we needs to be mindful of when we are communicating, myself as well. So those are a few lessons I think that, I mean, at least I took from the past 3 or 4 years, both kind of commenting about housing and reading about housing, and obviously agreeing and disagreeing with housing experts on kind of the root causes, the key drivers, and our differences. And I think it's important, I think when we're in this space, when I'm in this space, to have, obviously, I think we're always going to have some intellectual differences with people, but I think it's important to kind of, give space to people who, again, like I said, may not want to be, kind of vulnerable to certain accusations by kind of the mob of people who are running out and criticizing people's character rather than their ideas. And that's one lesson that I took from that. I think it's an important one. And, anyhow, I hope you all found that helpful. If you have any, obviously, questions or observations of your own over the past few years about how these narratives have changed, I mean, and obviously, even if you think I'm getting it wrong, again, this is just my view, I think, and kind of looking at and trying to understand how the narratives have changed and maybe what were some of the root causes that are not obvious, that are kind of behavioral. These are the things that I sometimes think about that I think, like I said, inform how I view the world and how I think. But again, obviously, they're just my own biased views. So obviously, if you think I got it wrong or you think I'm missing something, please just post them in the comments below, and or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.